think we're about ready to start. I see it's 2 o'clock.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Dan Sullivan. I'm the Vice President of the Council of Georgist Organizations. This is our second session for our virtual conference rather than our usual on-site conference. And we have Marty Rowland is going to introduce Nic Tideman, and we're going to talk about reclaiming the commons. And Marty is long active. He's on the board of the Henry George School of Social Sciences in New York City, and has done sessions with us before. And I'll just turn it over to Marty and step out of it. So go ahead, Marty.
Well, thanks a lot, Dan. Appreciate the intro and introduction. I want to say a few words for and introduce Nic Tideman. A very long history in the generationally in the Georgist movement. Before I get into that, I want to say that Nic is a professor at the University of Virginia.
No, it's Virginia Tech.
Virginia Tech, I'm sorry. But the thing that's notable is some of his accomplishments. In the 70s, he was on the Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors. And I think most notably, in my opinion, was the initiative he took to create and write an open letter to Gorbachev on November 7th, 1990. And in addition to that initiative is getting 29 other prominent economists to sign on to the letter. So I think that's something I'd like to get into that after we talk about his main topic today. But next areas of research interests are taxation of land, which I think you're probably going to hear some, voting theory and political philosophy. And if time allows, I'd like to learn more about the idea of political philosophy, because it forces an accounting of what society is and the purpose of government. So I think with that intro, I want to say that Nic needs no introduction because of his background of being a fourth generation Georgist. But Nic, let's just turn it over to you. We can get into more in the Q&A. So Nic, let's go ahead.
I'm talking today about a Georgist approach to intellectual property. How best to reward inventors, composers, and authors is a puzzle of economics and jurisprudence. On the one hand, we want to ensure that creators of new ideas and things are adequately motivated to create, because we all benefit so much for their innovations. On the other hand, the usual way of rewarding inventors and creators is the granting of monopolies. And this is arguably unjust for its restriction on liberty, as well as inherently inefficient, because it results in charges for actions that have no social cost, producing the inefficiency of non-use by those who would value the monopolized actions, but not value it enough to pay the monopoly price. Henry George's thinking on the issue of rewards for innovations evolved. In the initial editions of Progress and Poverty, in Book 8, Chapter 3, one finds a defense of the monopolies entailed in patents and copyrights. George wrote, "There are among us various sorts of monopolies. For instance, there are the temporary monopolies created by the patent and copyright laws. These would be extremely unjust and unwise to tax, inasmuch as they are but recognitions of the right of labor to its intangible productions, and constitute a reward held out to invention and authorship." Later editions amend this, adding at the end of the sentence above a long footnote that withdraws support for patents, but not for copyrights. In the patent In the footnote, George writes, following the habit of confounding the exclusive right granted by a patent and that granted by a copyright as recognitions of the right of labor to its intangible productions, I in this fell into error, which I subsequently acknowledged and corrected in the Standard of June 23rd, 1888. The two things are not alike, but essentially different. The copyright is not a right to the exclusive use of a fact, an idea, or a combination, which by the natural laws of property all are free to use, but only to the labor expended in the thing itself. It does not prevent anyone from using for himself the facts, the knowledge, the laws, or the combinations for a similar production, but only from taking the identical form of the particular book or other production. The actual labor, which has in short been expended in producing it. It rests therefore upon the natural moral right of each one to enjoy the products of his own exertion, and involves no interference with the similar right of anyone else to do likewise. The patent, on the other hand, prohibits anyone from doing a similar thing and involves, usually for a specified time, an interference with the equal liberty on which the right of ownership rests. The copyright is therefore in accordance with moral law. It gives to the man who has expended the intangible labor required to write a particular book or paint a particular picture security against the copying of that identical thing. The patent is defiance of this natural right. It prohibits others from doing what has already been attempted. Everyone has a moral right to think what I think, or to perceive what I perceive, or to do what I do, no matter whether he gets the hint from me or independently of me. Discovery can give no right of ownership, for whatever is discovered must have been already here to be discovered. If a man make a wheelbarrow or a book or a picture, he has a moral right to that particular wheelbarrow or book or picture, but no right to ask that others be prevented from making similar things. Such a prohibition, though given for the purpose of stimulating discovery and invention, really in the long run operates as a check upon them. End of footnote. In my opinion, George overstates the difference between patents and copyrights. While there are important differences between the two, there are also similarities, permitting the application of some of the same principles to both cases. First, consider patents. George is right that patents interfere with equal liberty, that, quote, whatever is discovered must have been already here to be discovered, end quote, and that an inventor has, quote, no right to ask that others be prevented from making similar things, end quote. This complaint of the injustice of patents has the form of a complaint of an enclosure of the commons. The commons and land is everyone's common heritage. We find it worthwhile to have parts of the commons enclosed, that is, assigned for the exclusive access of particular individuals. But where exclusive access occurs, it should improve overall efficiency, and to be proper, it must entail compensation for the community from the person with exclusive access. There is a commons of possible actions as well as a commons of land. There should be a presumption of a common right of all to actions that do not physically invade the persons or property of others. Others can even be harmed by one's actions without turning the action into something that should be prohibited or require compensation. For example, I can change barbers without compensating my current barber, even though this harms my current barber by reducing his income. So harming others is not the test of what is prohibited. Still, we sometimes do restrict liberty for the sake of the general welfare, as with restrictions on driving too fast. We should have such restrictions on liberty only when there are good reasons for them. George argues that there is not a good enough reason for the restrictions on liberty entailed in patents, that we should not prohibit others from copying without the permission of the inventor what the inventor has shown to be possible. Supporters of patents will say that the monopolies entailed in patents produced are worthwhile because they cause so much in improved productivity, that the resulting restrictions are justified as other restrictions on liberty that one finds in a civilized society. Implicit in this argument for patents is the assumption that there is no other way to motivate inventors adequately. In fact, there are a couple of possibilities that might work. First, one could declare inventors to be heroes. Heroes do wonderful things without expecting financial rewards. When Jonas Salk in the 1950s developed the polio vaccine that is named for him, I don't recall anyone suggesting that we should estimate the social value of what he did and pay him a significant fraction of that. He was a hero. If we had only a few inventors, calling them heroes might work, but there are too many inventors. Trying to make them all into heroes would dilute the concept of a hero too much. The other alternative to patents is to provide financial rewards to inventors without giving them monopolies of patents. Such an idea faces two challenges. One, where is the money going to come from? And two, how is the amount of money for each invention going to be decided? Even though a system of patents is inefficient and arguably unjust, at least it has answers to these questions. Under a system of patent monopolies, the money to reward the inventors comes from the excess above cost in the prices that inventors charge for inventions, and the amount is whatever emerges from the combination of market demand and monopoly supply. I believe that the better answer is available without monopolies. Since I am approaching the issue of compensating inventors from a Georgist perspective, one might expect me to propose using the revenue from taxing land to compensate inventors. From my perspective, however, there is a difficulty with using land taxes for this. From the perspective of justice, the revenue that comes from natural opportunities has a presumptive disposition. The part that is due to infrastructure should pay for that infrastructure. The part that is due to private development of surrounding land should go to those who use land in ways that raise the value of surrounding land. Incidentally, theory says that this will raise land values by more than it costs. The part due to nature is rightfully the source of basic income for all. It appears that all the rent from natural opportunities has just claimants, and there is no just way to use this revenue to reward inventors. There is a way around the argument just presented. The share of rent that is due to natural opportunities varies with circumstances, is what is left after appropriate payments for worthwhile infrastructure and for developments with net positive externalities. If the calculation of needed payments out of rent changes, then the calculation of rent from natural opportunities changes. For example, if a community becomes aware that they are subject to a risk of flooding that a seawall would prevent, then the rent from natural opportunities falls by the cost of building a seawall. Furthermore, if the seawall is deficient, then its cost will be less than the reduction in rent from the realization of the flood risk. Similarly, if a community becomes aware simultaneously that A, patents constitute an unjust restriction on individual liberty, and B, without rewards for inventors, the number of inventions will fall and incomes and land values will fall, then if payments to inventors will cause land values to rise by at least as much as the payments, it is appropriate to reward inventors out of rent from natural opportunities. This leaves unanswered the question of how one determines the right size of the reward fund and how to allocate among inventors, but it is a start. There's also the matter that the benefit from inventions will be greater than the effect on rent. As a first approximation, one might expect invention to increase the incomes from land, labor, and capital by the same percentage. Thus, the share of value of inventions reflected in land values would equal the share of rent in national income. By definition, national income is gross national product minus the quote, capital consumption allowance, that is depreciation. Estimating the share of labor in US national income as compensation of employees plus half of proprietors' income, the average share of labor in national income between 2010 and 2021 was 66.6%, call it 2/3. The remaining 1/3 of national income can be divided between the category of land and monopolies, which I will call land, and capital. Based on the detailed analysis of economic data, I concluded that US asset income is divided approximately 3/8 income from land and 5/8 income from capital. Thus, national income is roughly 2/3 labor income, 1/8 land income, and 5/24 income of capital. So if inventors were to receive the increase in land values that results from their inventions, they would receive about 1/8 of the value of their inventions for the period of payment. If the period payment was 10 years, then a person who produced invention with benefits of $800,000 per year would get $100,000 per year from the Public Land Rent Fund for 8 years. For 10 years, excuse me. That would be a nice start, but I think that inventors need more. Is there a principled way to see that they get it? To explore this question, we need to go in two directions. There's one answer in, quote, ideal theory, and another answer in, quote, non-ideal theory. In ideal theory, one takes no account of political feasibility. One discusses what is right irrespective of political feasibility. In non-ideal theory, one asks what changes that are politically imaginable would be desirable. In ideal theory, the principle that people have equal rights and natural opportunities is as widely recognized as the law of gravity. No one would think of denying it. As a result, there's no possibility of war. With no possibility of war, there is no need for the economies of scale and defense that are provided by large nations. And the nations divided into sovereign entities composed of like-minded persons, roughly the size of current counties, sharing the global rent from natural opportunities among themselves in proportion to populations. When sovereign entities are the size of counties, as I see it, it would be consistent with justice for such entities to have taxes other than land taxes, because anyone who objected could easily go somewhere else. Land taxes are adequate to finance public activities that provide approximately equal benefits and benefit everyone with access, but with benefits that decline with distance. However, activities that benefit only a fraction of the population or have benefits that do not vary with distance will not raise land values by enough to pay for themselves. Examples of such activities are schools and programs of assistance for the poor. I cannot see how a society could provide such activities if it taxed only land. Without them, people could not expect government help and could only have children responsibly if they and their parents were prepared to pay the full cost of schooling and of insurance against falling into poverty. I think that most people would prefer to live in societies that did not constrain having children to that extent, and would therefore choose to live primarily in societies that use taxes other than land taxes to finance schools, help for the poor, and other social activities that did not raise land values by enough to pay for themselves. The taxes a community used to pay for such activities could be whatever the community chose. But economists would probably recommend broad-based taxes because they generally cause less economic harm. A community could use land taxes to pay for these activities and reduce the basic income, but this would tend to make poor people even poorer. Therefore, taxes on consumption and on great wealth seem more likely. In such a world, it is easy enough to imagine the addition of compensation for inventors to the list of things for which communities levied non-land taxes, like providing schools and help for the poor. Participating in a global program for compensating inventors would be one of the things that responsible communities did. It would replace the need to enforce patent restrictions and would entail unrestricted access for the community to the use of all patents. It would not be possible to guarantee that no community would choose to be a free rider and not contribute, but any such community would be subject to shaming and possibly to economic boycotts. It is hard to know how large the fund for compensating inventors ought to be. I would suggest aiming to give inventors something like half the benefits of their inventions for 10 years. While I do not know how much money this would entail, a number from economic growth theory is relevant. In models of economic growth, there is what economists call the, quote, growth rate of technological progress. This is the growth rate over time of output from a given combination of inputs. There is debate over whether it should be regarded as a constant given by nature, exogenous, or a product of policies, endogenous, but in either case, it represents output that we get this year and could not have gotten last year with the same inputs. So it is an upper limit on the contribution of invention to this year's increase in input. For the US economy, the growth rate of technological progress seems to be quite close to 1% per year. Therefore, half of 1% of income is an upper limit on half the contribution of 1 year's inventions. And 5% of income is an upper limit on the half of the contribution to this year's output of inventions of the past 10 years. Thus, 5% of income is an upper limit on what we would need to pay inventors to pay them half the benefits of inventions for 10 years after they present their inventions. How many dollars would this be? Global GDP is about, excuse me here. Global GDP in 2021 was about $95 trillion. From this, we need to subtract the capital consumption allowance to get global income. In the US, the capital consumption allowance is about 16% of income. For the world as a whole, it is probably smaller since the world as a whole has a smaller share of capital. It's hard to know how much smaller. So global income is probably about $80 trillion. 5% of this is $4 trillion. Therefore, $4 trillion per year is a rough upper limit on what we would need currently to pay inventors if we wanted to pay them half the global benefits of inventions over the past 10 years. I suggest that in ideal theory, a global fund for rewarding inventors of up to $4 trillion per year from up to 5% of each country's income would be a just and a reasonably efficient replacement for patents. There might be an upper limit on total investor gain as a dollar amount and or as a multiple of research outlay. A global bureaucracy would evaluate inventions and determine the amounts of rewards. So despite all this complexity, I find a global system of rewards for inventions in exchange for global free access to all inventions to be more attractive than the current system of patent monopolies. Now for non-ideal theory. We do not yet have agreement that natural opportunities are everyone's common heritage. Still, we might get agreement that a system of patent monopolies is at least inefficient, if not unjust, and that therefore it is appropriate to replace patents with a global system of rewards for inventors, with contributions from all countries of a specified share of their incomes. Countries that chose not to participate would be expected to abide by patents under the current rules. Countries that did not participate would obtain their contributions from countries that did participate would obtain their contribution from whatever sources used for public revenue. Even though such taxes entail distortions that create inefficiencies, the distortions from broad-based taxes could be expected to be less costly than the monopoly prices entailed in patents in view of the general rule in public finance that equal percentage distortions across an economy are almost always less efficient than unequal ones. The conclusion for patents: they're inefficient and arguably unjust. We should strive to replace them with a global system of compensation for inventors, with all countries contributing in proportion to their incomes. Now, onto copyrights. George says, the copyright does not prevent anyone from using for himself the facts, the knowledge, the laws, or combinations for similar productions, but only from using the identical form of a particular book or other production, the actual labor which has, in short, been expended in producing it. It rests therefore upon the natural moral right of each one to enjoy the products of his own exertions and involves no interference with the similar right of anyone else to do likewise. I would agree with George if a copyrighted work had the nature of a purely private good. If a comedian creates a joke and makes a living telling the joke, and the joke is never discussed beyond the audience that hears it, then it is unjust for another comedian to deprive the first comedian of the audience for the joke by telling it to audience before the first comedian has a chance to relate it to them. If an author writes a novel and sells it to readers who enjoy reading it but never discuss it, then it is unjust for someone else to sell the same novel and deprive the writer of the market for that book. However, things are different when the work involved becomes part of public discourse. Consider the Happy Birthday song. The song has become a cultural icon. As a society, we gravitate toward a shared understanding of how we celebrate someone's birthday. Somehow, we wound up using the tune from the song Good Morning to All, which was first published in 1893. The Happy Birthday words were first published in 1901 in a poem with no reference to singing the words. There is pertinent reference from 1901 to a song called Happy Birthday to You, but the first known printing of the words and music together was in 1911. In 1935, the publisher of the 1893 Good Morning to All published a copyrighted book containing a version of the song with a slight change in the music, one note held for 2 beats instead of 2 separate notes, along with a new second verse. A copyright ogre bought this copyright in 1988 and demanded that any restaurant that allowed an employee to sing the song to customers pay $700 per performance. Use in films, TV shows, and concerts cost many thousands of dollars, generating total revenues of $2 million per year. However, when the copyright was challenged in court in a case that lasted from 2013 to 2015, there was a settlement that resulted in the song being declared in the public domain, with the company that had been claiming a copyright agreeing to pay $14 million in various forms of restitution. With slightly different facts, the case could have turned out differently if everyone involved had included prescribed kind of copyright notices in everything that had been published. There might have been enduring legal copyright. But this seems wrong. As a society, we ought to be able to settle on a culture of practice without having to pay a copyright ogre. My general point is that copyrighted creations are not purely private goods. They can become things to which one needs access to participate fully in ordinary social interactions. A business needs a way to receive faxes to interact with other business. It would be unjust if there were a monopoly supplier of patented fax machines whose permission every business needed to stay in business. Similarly, it would be unjust if no one could be in business without buying a copy of the copyrighted Word software to read documents sent by other businesses. It would also be unjust if no one could participate in public discourse without having read the latest John Grisham novel and its price was a week's wages. Any charge for something that everyone needs to be a self-respecting, productive member of the community is an enclosure of the commons. There should be no price of admission for social connectedness. Because the transformation of copyright from private goods into social connectedness is a gradual process that could happen to any work, it seems to be proper and just to treat the proper and just to treat the creativity of writing like the creativity of invention and replace copyrights with a system of awards. The amount of each award would depend on the length of the work, a proxy for the cost of production, and the number of times it was copied. Every book, every short story, every song, every movie, every TV show, and every piece of software would be available to everyone, paid for by taxes rather than a la carte prices. This is my version of an unenclosed commons of inventions, cultural symbols, and ideas. Thus, I believe that in the end, the proper treatment and inventions and works that are now copyrighted are more similar than different, despite the difference between finding and creating, because they both involve new things that can become essential parts of the web of connections among us all. Both should be freely available, with compensation for the creators coming from a combination of the increase in rent that they generate and taxes on consumption and wealth. Thank you.
That was great, Nick. This is Marty Rowland for those who knew late. I thought it was an excellent presentation about the idea of the commons. I looked through the chat and the Q&A. I didn't see any questions, but maybe people are writing those now. So while we wait for the people to weigh in, I thought maybe what I would do is go through my notes I took listening just now and maybe hope to clarify some of the things. I honestly think that people need to get access to the paper and study it for maybe a couple of weeks or more, and then have a lively discussion thereafter. But to get the first one, it seemed as though the angle that you were making is that both patents and copyright have a they have the reality of enclosing the commons, because you're excluding some people to have access to something that could be socially beneficial. You're saying rather than just let people nilly-willy just have access to come up with a global system of payment or reward or what you called it. But I guess my question to you would be to the difference between an idea that might be a better way of let's say a troll doll or maybe a Barbie and Ken versus something that have life-saving properties like a new drug or a technique or some kind of medical device. Could you have how the global system would figure out that price that the award would be?
Well, one of the places that I've thought about is with respect to music. It seems to me that there's a sort of a to what music is popular. It's popular for a while and then it disappears. And I'm not sure that any piece of music is essential for us. And people do get a lot of joy out of being up with the latest music. So I'm content to say that the value of music is reflected in the fact that people spend a lot of effort making sure that they have it. And so I'm willing to call music one of the things that people get compensated for creating and get compensated according to how many downloads it gets. That's an estimate of the social value, and we tax everybody in order to reward the inventors. On the other hand, I wouldn't mind too much if songwriters felt inadequately compensated and we got less songwriting as a result. I think that we have enough songwriting without overly compensating songwriters, but I would be content to be overruled by others in that. My opinion shouldn't count any more than anybody else's opinion. On the other hand, you can compare that with new drugs. New drugs are very expensive to produce. I think we should have a much less expensive process for approving them, but it's important to get more and more life-saving drugs, and we should expect to compensate those who produce them according to some estimate of the value that we get from these drugs, and then we should make them available to everybody. The idea that it should cost $80,000 to treat somebody with hepatitis C is ridiculous. We should just make the pills available to everybody for the marginal cost of producing them and give a nice big reward to the people who came up with the drugs. Charging by the cure just offends me. And I think it offends a lot of other people too. But we need to reward these people adequately. And so we need to come up with some sorts of rewards.
Okay, well, that's great. We do have 3 questions now. I thought rather than me following up on that last one, I'll go to the questions in the Q&A. And the first one's from Jeff Robert. His question is, since there is no monopoly, is there any reason not to reward creators for their natural life or 25 years, whichever is greater, particularly if rewards are based on distribution, even those purchased for the price of 0? Such a remedy is possible with a biometric digital currency. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I don't know enough about biometric digital currencies, but I can talk about the issue of how long the period of reward lasts.
Okay.
I am aware that when people have discussed how long copyright should last, one of the points that's brought up is that somebody might have produced a copyrighted work and then died and left dependents who would be needing the income from the patent. So you wouldn't necessarily want to cut it off immediately when somebody died. I think that there isn't any natural ending point. The lifetime of the author is one possibility, but I would like to create the possibility of the descendants who might have been financially dependent getting something without it going to infinity. And so I don't think that there's a natural cutoff point. And so I think we just need to settle on something. It seemed to me that 10 years might be enough, that somebody shouldn't be able to live for the rest of his life on one wonderful thing, no matter how wonderful it is. But again, I'm just one person. I'd like to have a discussion of the subject and see if we can get a consensus on what the right answer is.
Well, before we turn to Dan, I know Dan's got a question, but I wanted to clarify that I understood you to say during your presentation that there is this reward that would be made really early in the process, and that's what opens up the unencloses the commons. Was that your idea? Was that there would be a more definitive reward up front so that others could thereby benefit quickly thereafter?
Actually, I was going to have a reward equal to the estimated public benefits year by year.
Oh,
But a person who has that promise can take it to the bank or to the market and sell the right if he wants to have it all at once.
okay.
But the money officially would come year by year as the benefits accrued. So if circumstances led to a change up or down in our estimate of how much the benefit was, there would be a corresponding change up or down in the payment. We would just make an estimate every year as to what the benefit was for that year.
Okay, great. So Dan, why don't you go ahead and ask your question, then I'll get back to the Q&A.
Okay, yeah, it's a couple things. One was just in passing that public schools particularly have a tremendous impact on residential land values, and that before everybody listed their houses on the internet, they put out these magazines with a little picture of the house, and all it said was the amount of property taxes and the name of the school district. So people looking for residential housing, especially if they have children, look for housing where there's a good school district. So I think there's a big correlation to land values for those public schools. Whether there is for a university or whatever is a different question.
I agree that public schools have a very large effect. The quality of a public school has a very large effect on land values. What I claim, although I haven't studied this subject, is based on economic theory. I would expect that the sum of the effects on land values is less than the cost of the school.
Okay. The other thing was I've been noticing with movies that there's a thing called Rotten Tomatoes, which tabulates what all the critics have said, and then there's the score of what the audience has said. And quite often there are movies that get an extremely high review with the critics and an extremely low review with the audience, and vice versa. And so that makes me think that the critics, if we were rewarding people, we would have to be very leery of the critics dominating what gets rewarded and what doesn't.
Yes, I think what we mean by the benefit is a benefit as the population perceives it. And critics count too, and if there's any reason to believe that the benefits to them are more, we might possibly want to take that into account, but we want to ask what is the benefit to people, not what it is to critics, not what it is in the estimation of critics.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe this would have to be a forum where there's like an audience of diverse people that can stand up and boo or throw things.
Yeah, we would get information about benefit in whatever ways seem best, and then getting aggregates from Rotten Tomatoes of what the audience thought is an important possibility.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm going to go back to the question, the first one, Dev Preet Jossel. I think he's just making a critique of, if you presented this again, he was saying we need the numbers to understand this presentation. So he's just saying that as a comment. So I guess maybe the speed of your message was faster than some people could grasp. So the next one was Jeff Grobert again. In a Georgist economy, people pay rent to the commons for exclusive use of land. With intellectual property, it is the commons paying rent for the shared use of labor. Do you think that it is important? This is an important part of the Georgist equation.
I think that it's important for Georgists to have an answer to what we do about patents and copyrights, because they are monopolies. And I'm contributing to what I hope will be a conversation. Other people may have different ideas, but this is my contribution. And calling it the commons paying rent for the shared use of labor is an interesting possibility. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Okay, well, good. So we'll look forward to another opportunity to explore these ideas. The next one's Caitlin Shepard-Walren. I wonder what would be the biggest obstacles to the government to even run a pilot program with this reward concept. I think the idea, maybe if there was a board game or something, maybe people could learn by doing.
I haven't thought about a board game. I have thought about applying it first in one particular area. And it seems to me that the area of drugs is the likely candidate. That I can imagine a government saying that is acquiring all the patents by eminent domain and paying the current holders appropriate compensation in line with the Fifth Amendment, just to see what it's like to take an area where monopoly profits are valuable and where it would be very valuable to have access to the things without the monopoly profits, and see if we can do it and what it's like. So I think that the idea of it doing it experimentally is best thought of as picking a sector and doing it. And I can imagine that happening.
Yeah, this just occurred to me listening to the MMT lectures recently, that this could turn into like a guaranteed job idea, where people are submitting questions just so that they wouldn't have to work doing other things. So is there a chance that what you're talking about could be perverted into something that wasn't originally intended?
Well, you would need careful behavior by those who set the awards. One example of something like that that comes to mind is the people who click on ads for a living in order to generate revenue that they somehow acquire according to the number of clicks. Now, that reflects a bad estimate of how valuable the ad is. So if we have bad estimates of the value of inventions and allow people to claim rewards for things that aren't valuable, that's to our detriment, and we have to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Okay. So Jeff Graybert again says the benefits to people is exactly determined by distribution. You agree?
Well, no, the benefit to people varies widely. I think that I get very little benefit from modern music. And some people who listen to modern music wouldn't mind if it was something entirely different. If they didn't have it, they would be content with something else. Other people find modern music to be very valuable to them personally, and really would find their life less valuable if they didn't have access to the latest variations in music. So we each have our own private valuations of these things, and we have to compensate according to some average. And we only want to give a fraction because we know that we're overcharging some people and undercharging others.
Yeah.
But it's not determined in any way that we can know in advance.
Yeah, we're kind of showing our age when we make our opinions like this.
Sure.
So the next one is James Frederickson. How should people who try but fail to develop a new drug be compensated?
There are two possibilities. One is to compensate for the failures. The other is to compensate for the successes, and not sufficiently to make it worth trying, even if you might fail.
Okay.
And it's hard to know which of those is the better way of doing things. You don't want to do both. You want to either compensate for the failures or put an extra bonus in for the successes to compensate for the possibility of failure.
Yeah, so it's kind of like in your smart talk with Ed Dodson, you mentioned about Alexander Graham Bell. So would there be a system of rewarding the guy that came in second in the telephone patent?
Yeah, well, I think that what we would do is we would say that the reward to an inventor would depend in part on how implausible the invention was. If the invention was something that anybody could have, or any appropriately trained engineer could have come up with, if we just asked them what the question was, we'd say, very interesting and it's valuable, but anybody could have done it, so you don't get much of a reward.
Okay. So let's go to Bill Batt's question. Since many, even most creative products are due to the reliance of inventors standing on the shoulders of those that have come before, how do we discourage the windfall gains that come accidentally to those fortuitously placed? Bill Gates' wealth depended on many who preceded him, yet he was the main beneficiary.
Yeah. Well, again, what we have to say is what was the reasonable cost of production of what Bill Gates did, given the environment in which he was working. We don't give him as much credit as we would have given him if he had more of a blank slate to work with. I believe that the first version of MS-DOS was something that he bought from somebody down the street rather than something that he actually created.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Augusta Nanarini. Thank you, Nick, for the interesting presentation. I am wondering, would this system also work for inventions in the digital space? Thinking of social media and similar online platforms, should the inventors of these, like Facebook, Twitter, be rewarded with tax revenue, and the comms would ultimately own their platforms?
I'm not sure. I'm inclined to think that these companies could operate without patents and copyrights, that we can have any number of different social media organizations without copyrights looking for customers. And I don't think that the system of copyrights would, or its lack, would make much difference to these companies. I'm content with a system of trademarks so that you can't pretend to be somebody who you aren't. I don't think that people should be able to infringe on other people's trademarks. And I would distinguish that from copying their ideas or their words. So on the other hand, if it turned out that Facebook needed some kind of copyright in order to work, and we felt it was appropriate to, well, I just don't, I think that social media would be outside the system. I don't think that there would be any compensation for them. I don't think there'd be any copyright or patent protection for them.
Oh, okay. Let's see, we got one that goes into voting, and I think that maybe that goes into your area of expertise, but it says, how about quadratic voting for categories and distribution within the category?
I would say that question is not sufficiently specified for me to address it.
Oh,
There might be some relevance there to how we decide what the right way to set the rewards is, but
that's why I was thinking that, even though he didn't ask that, I was thinking that maybe the panel that's making these decisions are
Yeah.
subject to some kind of voting scheme.
It might be that you would want some kind of weighted voting, and quadratic voting is a version of weighted voting. So it might be relevant in taking account of the strength of the views of the different members of a panel. But that is sufficiently far off that I don't know how
But you know, people in New York are familiar with ranked voting, so we know what that is.
yes.
How does that vary with the quadratic?
Well, in quadratic voting, you express the intensities of your preferences rather than the ranking.
Okay, okay. Well, there's one in the chat that's kind of long, so let me read it. We got about 8 minutes before the top of the hour. But would it be possible if some large percentage of people worldwide formed a public-private company that could democratically / intelligently purchase all the important copyrights, patents, land, common resources directly, charge reasonable rents, and share the proceeds with all the people worldwide equally as a universal basic dividend? How could we begin to form a global company like this to implement Georgist policies worldwide?
Well, I don't think we can reasonably expect to come up with the resources with which to do that. It's somewhat like the proposal to end slavery by buying out all the slave owners.
Yeah, yeah.
You shouldn't need to buy them out. They should recognize that what they think is their property isn't, and it just has to be given up. So I think that the path of reform has to be saying, oops, we made a mistake. We're going to start doing things differently. Now, it's not exactly the same, because we do want to recognize the contribution that the creators have made. But we want to say it was wrong to give you a monopoly, and but we'll give you something else instead. Whereas I think that with respect to taxing land, we want to say that it was wrong to let you have land titles untaxed. Now, the title of land goes with paying a tax.
Okay. Well, since we've got a little bit of time, and I've got a question kind of relates to what we were talking about before the program started. I was thinking about what we were talking about in Alfred E. Kahn and the Civil Aeronautics Board. And there's various ramifications of what happened during the 70s when the regulatory reform, deregulation came on. And what occurred to me was that whenever you don't have the collection of resource rents or land rents that are community owned, then you get into this situation where you have these public wrongs, I guess. And then once you start arguing about, well, how do you best fix the public wrongs while the land rent is not being collected, then you go off into some other netherworld that it's unfortunate that it's going that way, but it's kind of like the penalty for not doing things right in the first place. Did you want to comment on that?
I can't get my hands around what
Okay.
it's too complicated. I
Okay.
didn't. pick
Well,
it
the
up.
reason I brought it up is that I was very critical of Alfred E. Kahn,
Yeah,
and he was one of the signers of that Gorbachev letter.
Yeah.
Kind of curious about how he fit in. And my observation was that I think there was an intention by the government to provide air travel to the small cities. And once the Civil Aeronautics Board was disbanded and the private free market started reigning, then a lot of the service was not then provided. So the government intervened to provide the service to more people. But I think what you were referring to was there was a lack of doing something correctly, which led to the Civil Aeronautics Board.
well, in my view, the difficulty is that you can't get service to small places unless somebody's willing to cover the losses. And you could make it, the profits that they got elsewhere, a condition for, you could make the service to small communities a condition for being able to continue to get the big profits. On the other hand, it seems to me there's an issue of fairness that the people who want to fly the main route should be allowed to have the low prices that come from competition, and the small communities, if they want service, should tax the land and provide subsidies to the airlines that then provide the service.
Yeah, okay. We did get another one while we were waiting. It's from Walter Horn, and he says, do you think that the changes you are suggesting would have any effect on the current problems involved with protecting copyrights and patents? Would you expect the same sorts of shenanigans involving, say, uploading books or counterfeiting brands?
Yeah. Well, I would distinguish between the two. I would allow Google, if they want to establish a library that has every book on it, and everybody could just go to Google every time they wanted to read a book. That would be fine with me. On the other hand, faking brands is a fraud, and it doesn't give people what they think they're buying, and should be prohibited and sanctioned.
Okay. Well, Sue and Dan, I've gone through all the questions.
You have one more. Heather has a question
Heather, okay, where's Heather's question?
in the Q&A.
Oh, okay, yeah, I've got to go back to Q&A now. Okay, Heather Remoff says, how do you get around the problem of the determination or predetermination of worth being made by someone or some entity other than the ultimate consumer of the product? Additionally, where does your concept fit with the Georgist soundbite, pay for what you take, not for what you make?
Well, I think of copyright sort of in the same category with public parks. We all pay for public parks, whether we walk in them or not. We know that public parks is something that good communities spend some of their money on, and that some people get more than their money's worth, or their taxes, out of the fact that we have public parks, and some people get less. Now, if we were collecting all the rent of land, people who lived close to the parks would be paying more than people who lived far from the parks. And we don't have that same closeness and distance relationship when it comes to copyright. So we have to just say it's something that we provide for everybody, like weather reports, and we consult everyone and try to come up with some estimate of the value that depends on what it's worth to everyone and average them in some appropriate way, and recognizing that we only have an approximation, we don't have the right answer. And because we only have an approximation, we don't try to give the creator all of the benefit. We give the creator a fraction of the benefit, reflecting our uncertainty and the fact that we know that the value to different people is widely dispersed.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'd like to, end the program thanking the Council of Georgia's organizations for this opportunity to have Nick and having all these excellent questions. I will invite people to visit the Henry George School of Social Science.org. Well, it's HGSSS.org. Look for the various programs that are coming up and courses. But that's all I really have.
Yeah, I have a couple of little comments on our next issue, and I'm going to make a promo for a Fiercey, which is Jeff Graybart's enterprise. He's very enthused, and I think this really fit in with what Jeff is all about. Our next webinar is this coming Tuesday. It is Recovering the Urban Commons. It is the Baltimore Thrive Land Value Tax Implementation Project with Alana Hartzog, Vanessa Beck, Lorenzo Gastonuevo, and Mike O'Mara talking about their work in Baltimore and trying to put things in reality. And next Saturday, just so you're aware of, Fred Harrison will be with us. He's going to talk about recovering the commons around the world. The time has come. Strategies for revising Georgism as a global movement. We appreciate your time. We also want to thank our newest sponsor, Shepherd Wallen, who is Nick's publisher. Shepherd Wallen is also the publisher of Heather Remoff's book and is also Fred Harrison's publisher. So we thank their support of our actions. And if you want, if people would like, we can keep the chat open and we'll make you all panelists. We will stop the basic recording and we can chat if people would like that. So.
Okay. Well, they also published Brian Hodgkinson's book on the model for the new economy. So
Okay, good.
Excellent.
We thank you all and everything. So if people would like to, I'll just make you I'll open it up so that you can talk and things like that. And let's see, a lot of